Sarah Mitchell sat rigidly in the defendant's chair, her navy blue dress pressed and pristine, though it hung slightly loose on her frame. She'd lost 20 pounds during the trial. Stress and anxiety had stolen her appetite and her sleep. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her pale blue eyes were fixed straight ahead, though she could feel the weight of everyone's stares bearing down on her like a physical force. The courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and curious onlookers who had followed the case through local news coverage. The drama of a young woman accused of a violent bank robbery had captured the town's imagination for months. The trial had lasted 3 grueling weeks. 3 weeks of sitting in this same chair, listening to witnesses describe a suspect they claimed was her, watching grainy security footage that could have been almost anyone, and hearing prosecutor Richard weave together a narrative designed to convince 12 jurors that she was a criminal. Sarah's public defender, Tom Bradley, was competent enough, but he was overworked and underfunded, just another case in his overwhelmingly busy practice. She could sense his lack of conviction, his quiet surrender to the inevitable. The jury had deliberated for 2 days. 48 hours of waiting in a holding cell, of staring at concrete walls, of imagining what 12 strangers were discussing in that locked room. 48 hours of her mother calling obsessively, begging her to remain hopeful. 48 hours of knowing, deep in her bones, that the system was stacked against her. Now, at 2:47 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon in October, the jury filed back into the courtroom. Their faces were carefully blank, trained by the judge not to reveal their verdict through their expressions. Sarah's heart hammered so violently she thought everyone in the courtroom must be able to hear it. She felt Tom's hand brush her shoulder in what was meant to be reassuring, but it felt hollow. Judge Wheeler, a stern woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair and bifocals, looked over her reading glasses at the jury foreman, a middle-aged man named Robert who worked as an accountant at a local firm. "Have you reached a verdict?" the judge asked formally. "We have, Your Honor," Robert replied, his voice steady and controlled. He handed a slip of paper to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. Judge Wheeler unfolded it slowly, reading it silently while everyone held their collective breath. Sarah noticed the judge's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. That tiny gesture felt like a death knell. "The jury finds the defendant guilty on the charge of armed robbery," the judge announced, her voice echoing through the courtroom. "The jury finds the defendant guilty on the charge of bank robbery. The jury finds the defendant guilty on all counts." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Guilty, guilty, guilty. The words seemed to bounce off the walls, multiplying and surrounding her. The courtroom erupted. Spectators gasped, several reporters stood immediately to leave so they could file their stories, and the bailiff called for order. Sarah felt the room spin. She gripped the edge of the defendant's table to steady herself, her knuckles turning white. Tom Bradley placed a hand on her arm and leaned close. "We'll appeal," he said quietly. "This isn't over." But his words sounded rehearsed, empty, the standard consolation offered by a lawyer who had just lost another case in a long string of losses. Sarah couldn't respond. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe properly. Her vision tunneled as panic clawed at her chest. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. She hadn't robbed that bank. She had never committed a crime in her life, not even a speeding ticket. She was a substitute teacher and occasional babysitter who volunteered at the community center's after-school program. She was the woman who brought casseroles to church fundraisers and helped elderly neighbors carry in their groceries. But somewhere in the gallery behind her, she heard a sound that broke through her shock, a sob. Sarah's mother, Ruth, was crying uncontrollably. The sound was raw and anguished, the sound of a woman's world shattering. Ruth had sat in that gallery every single day of the trial, her face a mirror of hope and prayer that had gradually transformed into dawning horror as the prosecution built its case. Sarah turned in her chair and their eyes met across the courtroom. Her mother's face was devastated, tears streaming down her cheeks, her hand covering her mouth. Sarah wanted to reach out to her, to comfort her, to somehow make this better, but the bailiffs were already approaching, ready to lead her away. Before they could reach her, Sarah pulled out a worn, faded photograph from her dress pocket, a picture she'd kept with her throughout the trial. It was a photo of her and her younger brother David, taken when they were children at a family reunion. David couldn't have been more than 14, his arm around Sarah's shoulders, both of them laughing at something their father had said. Sarah had kept that photo as a silent reminder of the truth, that David was the real perpetrator, that he had orchestrated this robbery, that he had allowed her innocent sister to face these charges rather than confess his own guilt. The bailiffs gently but firmly took her arms. "Come with us, Ms. Mitchell," one of them said, not unkindly. Sarah stood on unsteady legs, gripping the photograph so hard it crumpled slightly in her hand. She held it against her chest as they led her toward the back exit of the courtroom. "I didn't do this," she called out, her voice breaking. "I didn't do this." But her protests were swallowed by the noise and chaos of the courtroom. Reporters shouted questions at her, spectators whispered and pointed, and her mother's sobs continued to echo in her ears as they led her away. Judge Wheeler's voice boomed over the tumult, announcing the sentencing hearing would take place in 2 weeks. But Sarah barely heard it. She felt disconnected from her own body, as if she were watching this happen to someone else, someone she deeply. As they led her down the hallway toward the holding cells, Sarah caught a glimpse of herself in a mirror on the wall. The woman staring back at her looked hollow, defeated, and utterly broken. At 28 years old, Sarah Mitchell was about to lose 5 years of her life, years she could never reclaim, years that belonged to her brother's cowardice and her own tragic misfortune. She crumpled the photograph of David in her fist, and for the first time since the trial began, she allowed herself to cry. The state penitentiary was a maze of concrete, steel, and despair. Sarah Mitchell had been incarcerated for 5 years now, and the initial shock of prison life had long since faded into a gray, monotonous routine. She woke at 6 a.m., ate the same institutional food in the cafeteria with hundreds of other women, attended her job in the prison library, and returned to her small cell by 9 p.m. The days blurred together into weeks, the weeks into months, the months into years. She'd become just another inmate, identified by her prisoner number rather than her name. The appeals process had been a disappointment after another. Tom Bradley had filed an initial appeal that went nowhere. A new attorney had taken her case, but seemed to lack genuine interest. Sarah had begun to accept that this was her life now, that she would serve her 8-year sentence and emerge as a 40-year-old woman with a felony record and no prospects. She had slowly learned to stop hopping, because hope only made the disappointment more crushing. But then on a Tuesday afternoon in March, a guard came to her cell with an unusual message. "Mitchell, you have a visitor in the conference room. Lawyer." Sarah's first thought was confusion. She wasn't expecting anyone. She hadn't had a visitor in months. Her mother came occasionally, but Ruth had called ahead when she planned to visit. Sarah followed the guard down the fluorescent-lit hallways, her mind spinning with questions. When they reached the small interview room, she found a man in his early 40s sitting at a metal table, a thick manila folder in front of him. He had dark hair just beginning to gray at the temples, intelligent brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and an intensity about him that immediately made Sarah sit up. "Sarah Mitchell," he asked, standing to shake her hand. I'm an attorney with the Innocence Project based out of Philadelphia. I've been reviewing your case file, and I believe we have significant grounds for an appeal." Sarah's breath caught. After 5 years of disappointment, those words sounded like fiction. What do you mean?" Sat back down and opened his folder, revealing dozens of documents, photographs, and notes covered in highlighter marks and handwritten annotations. "I've spent the last 3 months combing through every piece of evidence from your original trial. I've reviewed the detective's reports, the witness testimony, the court transcripts, and the physical evidence. And Sarah, I've found some very serious problems." Over the next 2 hours, laid out his findings like a skilled architect unveiling blueprints. His voice was passionate but measured, his arguments meticulous and compelling. Detective Michael Harrison, the lead investigator on her case, had obtained critical evidence that was never presented to the defense, evidence that contradicted the prosecution's timeline and suggested another suspect entirely. Furthermore, Harrison had interviewed a witness who placed someone matching David Mitchell's description near the bank on the morning of the robbery, but this interview report had disappeared from the official case file. It was still in Harrison's personal notes, discovered only through an unauthorized search of archived records. "This is prosecutorial misconduct," explained, his eyes burning with righteous anger. "Your public defender should have had access to this information. The prosecution knew about these inconsistencies and deliberately them. That's a violation of v. Maryland, a Supreme Court precedent that requires prosecutors to disclose exculpatory evidence." Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in 5 years, a fragile stirring of hope. "So what does this mean?" "It means we have grounds for a retrial," said. "It won't be easy. The prosecution will fight hard to keep the original conviction standing, but I believe we have a legitimate chance. More importantly, I believe in your innocence. I've worked on enough wrongful conviction cases to recognize the pattern, and Sarah, your case has all the hallmarks of a miscarriage of justice." Over the following weeks, visited frequently, building his case methodically and thoroughly. He interviewed the original witnesses, discovering that the woman who had to seeing Sarah at the bank had severe vision problems and wore the wrong prescription glasses that day. He tracked down Detective Harrison, who, now retired, admitted that he had always suspected David Mitchell was involved, but had never pursued him as a suspect because Sarah had been so cooperative and cooperative people rarely commit armed robberies. Also hired an independent forensic analyst to re-examine the physical evidence, specifically, the fingerprints found at the scene. The new analysis revealed that the prints were partial and degraded and could not definitively be linked to Sarah. In fact, when compared to prints from other bank employees, they were remarkably similar to prints belonging to the bank's assistant manager, a man named Gregory, who had gone missing 3 days after the robbery. Explained during one of their meetings, disappeared from his apartment and hasn't been heard from since. The original investigation barely looked into him because they focused so heavily on you, but his sudden disappearance after the robbery seems like more than a coincidence. Sarah's heart pounded as the pieces came together. For 5 years, she had carried the burden of being a convicted felon. For 5 years, she had walked the prison yard, eaten the prison food, and accepted the prison routine as her permanent fate. Now, suddenly, there was evidence. There was reasonable doubt. There was a possibility, just the smallest possibility, that she might actually get out of this place. Worked around the clock, filing motions and appeals, presenting evidence to judges, and arguing with prosecutors who wanted the original conviction to stand. The state attorney general's office fought back vigorously. They argued that the evidence was insignificant, that the new forensic analysis was unreliable, and that Sarah's conviction was solid, but was relentless. He was a man on a mission, driven by a genuine belief in his client's innocence and a deep commitment to the cause of overturning wrongful convictions. Finally, after 8 months of legal battles, a judge agreed to hear their motion. And then, in a stunning turn of events, the judge ruled that Sarah had been a fair trial and granted her a new trial. When the prison guard came to Sarah's cell with the news, she actually cried, not from sadness but from something she thought she'd lost forever, genuine hope. Visited her the next day, and Sarah saw tears in his eyes too. "You're going home," he said simply. "We're going to prove your innocence, Sarah, I promise you that." As Sarah was transferred from the state penitentiary to a holding facility near the courthouse where her new trial would take place, she felt as if she were waking from a long nightmare. 5 years had been taken from her, but now, Finally, there was a chance to reclaim her life. Had believed in her when no one else did. He had looked at the evidence with fresh eyes and seen the truth that the original system had missed. Sarah Mitchell was about to get her second chance at justice. 72 hours. That's all had. 3 days until Sarah Mitchell's retrial began, and he still didn't have the smoking gun that would conclusively prove her innocence. The circumstantial evidence against her was circumstantial enough to create reasonable doubt, but doubt alone might not be enough to sway 12 jurors. What needed was David Mitchell, Sarah's younger brother, the man who had orchestrated the bank robbery 5 years ago and allowed his innocent sister to rot in prison for his crime. Sat in his small law office in Philadelphia at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night, surrounded by case files, coffee cups, and the detritus of his obsessive investigation. His colleagues had long since gone home. The building was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic on the street below. He had been working on Sarah's case for 11 months straight, often sleeping in his office, surviving on caffeine and the burning conviction that justice needed to be served. He was reviewing witness statements for the 100th time when his phone buzzed. An unknown number. Almost didn't answer. He received crank calls occasionally, people with theories about cases, people seeking legal advice they couldn't afford to pay for. But something made him pick up. "Is this?" a muffled voice asked. The caller had blocked their number. "It is. Who is this?" "I can't tell you my name, but I know where David Mitchell is. He's living in Colorado in a town called Boulder. He's working construction under the assumed name David. He works for Cascade Construction Company. That's all I can tell you." The line went dead. Sat in stunned silence, his mind racing. An anonymous tip. It could be real, or it could be a wild goose chase that would waste the precious 72 hours he had left. But every instinct in his body told him this was legitimate. The tip was specific, too specific to be fabricated. A town, a company, an assumed name. This was the break he'd been waiting for. He immediately called the FBI field office in Denver. After 20 minutes of being transferred between agents, he finally reached Special Agent Susan Williams, who listened to his explanation with professional skepticism. "We can't just pick up David Mitchell based on an anonymous tip," Agent Williams explained. "We need evidence of an actual crime, and even then, we need probable cause. What you're describing sounds like a cold case that would take weeks to properly investigate." "I don't have weeks," said desperately. "I have 72 hours. My client's retrial begins Monday morning. If David Mitchell testifies that he committed the robbery, it could exonerate my client completely." "I understand your situation, mister, but federal resources don't work that fast. I can file a report, but I can't promise." Hung up. The FBI would move at their bureaucratic pace, following procedures and protocols while Sarah's chance at justice slipped away. He needed to take matters into his own hands. He called a private investigator he'd worked with before, a former cop named Dale Harrison who had connections throughout the country. "I need you in Boulder, Colorado by tomorrow morning," said urgently. "I need you to find a man named David Mitchell, also going by David, working for Cascade Construction Company. I need his address, his phone number, everything. And I need it fast." "This is going to be expensive," Dale warned. "Money is not a factor. Find him." By 6 a.m. Wednesday morning, Dale had called back. David Mitchell was indeed in Boulder, living in a modest apartment on Pearl Street, working for Cascade Construction. The investigator had obtained his phone number but hadn't approached him directly, not yet knowing what they were dealing with. Stared at the phone number for a long moment. He could call David himself, but what would he say? "Hello, I know you're wanted in connection with a crime 5 years ago. Will you come back to Pennsylvania and confess?" It wouldn't work. David had spent 5 years building a new life, and he wouldn't voluntarily throw it away. Knew he had to approach this differently. He needed leverage. He needed someone David would listen to. He needed family. He called Ruth Mitchell, Sarah's mother, at her home in Pennsylvania. Ruth worked as a nurse at a local hospital and had visited Sarah regularly throughout her imprisonment. She was a woman of deep faith and unshakable love for both her children, even the one who had betrayed them so terribly. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is. I need to ask you something very delicate, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you have any contact with David?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Ruth finally spoke, her voice was small and ashamed. I've maintained some contact with him over the years. He sends me money sometimes, anonymously. He calls occasionally from untraceable numbers. He's my son, mister. Despite everything he's done, he's still my son, and I never stopped loving him. Felt a surge of hope. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need you to contact him. I need you to call him today and tell him that his sister is innocent and suffering in prison because of his crime. I need you to tell him that Sarah's retrial begins Monday, and this is his last chance to do the right thing. Can you do that?" Yes, I can try. He calls me regularly. He might call today. When he calls, you need to convince him to contact me immediately. Tell him I'm his only way out of this. Tell him that if he doesn't come forward, the evidence against him is going to come out anyway, and he'll face even worse charges: obstruction of justice, conspiracy. But if he testifies voluntarily, he'll have leverage with the court. It was a calculated manipulation, but it was also the truth. That evening at 9:47 p.m., his phone rang. It was a blocked number, but he knew who it was. "Mister," a hesitant voice asked, "this is David Mitchell." His heart nearly stopped. "David, thank you for calling. I need to talk to you about Sarah." For the next hour, laid out everything: the evidence of prosecutorial misconduct, the inconsistencies in the original investigation, the 5 years his sister had spent in prison for a crime he had committed. He spoke calmly but with passion, painting a picture of injustice and redemption. "If you testify," explained, "you'll be facing charges, yes, but you'll be facing them as someone who came forward voluntarily, someone who told the truth. That matters to judges and juries. That shows character and conscience." David was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice breaking with emotion. "I've carried this guilt for 5 years. Every day I wake up thinking about Sarah, about what I did to her. I've been a coward my whole life, but maybe it's not too late to do one thing right." "Does that mean you'll testify?" asked, hardly daring to breathe. "Yes," David said quietly. "Yes, I'll testify. I'll tell them everything. I did it. I robbed that bank. Sarah is innocent. I did it." Felt tears streaming down his face. He had his witness. He had his confession. He had the truth. "Get on a plane tonight," instructed. "Fly to Philadelphia. I'll have someone meet you at the airport. We have 72 hours to prepare you for court, and we're going to get my client, your sister, exonerated." As he hung up the phone, looked at the clock, 11:47 p.m. on Wednesday night. Sarah's retrial would begin Monday morning. 72 hours had just become the most important hours of Sarah Mitchell's life. The courthouse was swarming with media by Monday morning. News vans lined the street outside. Reporters stood in clusters discussing talking points, and camera crews positioned themselves strategically for the best angles. The case of Sarah Mitchell had become a local sensation. A young woman getting a second chance at justice 5 years after being convicted of a crime she didn't commit. It was the kind of story that captured public imagination, and everyone wanted to know how it would end. Sarah sat in the holding cell behind the courtroom, wearing the same navy blue dress she'd worn 5 years ago when she was first convicted. It had been stored in evidence all these years, and she'd requested it specifically. It felt like a symbolic assertion of her innocence. She was literally wearing the same clothes as the victim of injustice, refusing to accept the identity of criminal that had been thrust upon her. Sat across from her, his expression focused and determined. "Remember what we discussed," he said quietly. When you're on the stand, speak clearly and calmly. Make eye contact with the jurors. Don't get defensive if the prosecutor tries to provoke you. Your honesty is your greatest weapon." Sarah nodded, but her hands were shaking. She'd prepared for this moment for months, but now that it was here, fear threatened to overwhelm her. In a few minutes, she would walk into that courtroom. In a few days, 12 strangers would decide her fate once again. The thought was terrifying. At 9:30 a.m., the bailiff came to get her. Sarah stood on unsteady legs and followed him through the hallway. As she entered the courtroom, she scanned the gallery and found her mother's face. Ruth Mitchell sat in the front row, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, her eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights. Beside her sat a team of paralegals and investigators. In the back row, she spotted several reporters with notepads and recording devices. The judge, a different judge this time, a woman known for her fairness and careful attention to legal procedure, entered the courtroom. The jury was sworn in, 12 people who would hold Sarah's future in their hands. Some looked sympathetic, others neutral, one or two seemed skeptical. Sarah tried not to read too much into their expressions. Prosecutor Richard stood to present the state's case. He was the same prosecutor who had convicted her 5 years ago, and he had a reputation for being aggressive and persuasive. He wore an expensive suit and projected the kind of confidence that came from winning most of his cases. He looked completely unbothered by the fact that he was prosecuting the same woman twice for the same crime. "Ladies and of the jury," began, his voice smooth and practiced, "5 years ago, a bank in this community was robbed. A crime that shook our town, that frightened citizens who relied on that bank, that violated the sense of safety and security we all deserve. Today, we will present evidence that Sarah Mitchell committed that crime. We will show you that she had the means, the motive, and the opportunity. We will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of armed robbery and bank robbery." Over the next 3 hours, presented his case methodically. He called the bank manager, who about the robbery, how 3 masked individuals had entered during mid-morning, how they'd pointed guns at customers and staff, how they'd fled with approximately $87,000 in cash. Then came the security guard, a man named Thomas Bradley, who that he'd seen the female robber's face for approximately 3 seconds before she'd fired a warning shot into the ceiling. "It was the defendant," he said, pointing at Sarah. "I'm sure of it." Immediately began taking notes. When it was time for cross-examination, he would attack this identification vigorously. Next came the fingerprint evidence. A forensic technician that fingerprints found on the counter of the teller's station matched Sarah Mitchell's fingerprints on file. It was technical testimony, presented with charts and images. The technician spoke with the authority of someone who dozens of times presented surveillance footage from outside the bank, showing 3 figures in dark clothing and masks entering and exiting the building. The lead figure, the one claimed was Sarah, was approximately 54 to 56 in height. Sarah was 55. The prosecution was building a circumstantial case, layer upon layer of connections that seemed to add up to guilt. But then rose for cross-examination of the fingerprint technician. "You that these are partial fingerprints, is that correct?" asked. "Yes, they're partial," the technician admitted. "And partial fingerprints are much more difficult to definitively match than full fingerprints, aren't they?" "That's true. In fact, there's significantly more room for error with partial prints." "Yes, there's more margin for error." Then presented his own forensic expert, Dr. Elizabeth, no relation, who that the fingerprints in question were too degraded and partial to be definitively matched to Sarah, and that they were remarkably similar to fingerprints belonging to Gregory, the bank's assistant manager who had disappeared after the robbery. The courtroom shifted slightly. Some jurors leaned forward with interest, looked annoyed but maintained his composure. When the security guard was recalled for cross-examination, attacked his eyewitness identification. "You said you saw the robber's face for 3 seconds, correct?" "Yes, approximately 3 seconds." and she was wearing dark clothing and a mask. Yes, but I saw her face. Mr. Bradley, in the weeks and months following the robbery, how many times did you view surveillance footage of the incident? I'm not sure, several times. Dozens of times. Perhaps. And each time you viewed it, the image became more familiar to you. I suppose. In fact, Mr. Bradley, studies show that repeated exposure to an image can actually implant false memories, can't it? The more you see an image, the more it becomes embedded in your memory, even if your initial identification was incorrect. I don't know about that. I know what I saw. But the damage was done, had planted seeds of doubt about the witness's reliability. By the afternoon of the first day, Sarah was called to testify. She stood, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. As she sat in the witness box, she looked directly at the jury and spoke clearly. "I did not rob that bank," she said simply. "I have never committed a crime in my life. I was working as a substitute teacher that day. I have receipts showing that I was at a local coffee shop at 10:30 a.m., and I have credit card records showing purchases I made across town at 11:15. There is no way I could have been at the bank during the robbery." His cross-examination was brutal. He tried to trip her up, to suggest inconsistencies, to paint her as a liar covering for her brother. But Sarah remained calm and consistent. She looked him in the eye and repeated the same truth. "I didn't do it." By the end of the first day of trial, something had shifted in the courtroom. The case that had seemed so clear-cut 5 years ago now seemed murky and complicated. Doubt had been introduced, reasonable doubt that might just be enough. As Sarah was led back to her holding cell that evening, she allowed herself to feel a fragile ray of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this jury would see the truth. The second day of trial began with tension crackling through the courtroom like electricity. Sarah sat at the defense table, her eyes fixed on the courtroom doors, waiting for her brother to arrive. Had coached David extensively, but even the best preparation couldn't fully prepare someone for the ordeal of courtroom testimony. David had spent 5 years running, 5 years hiding, 5 years consumed by guilt. Now he would finally face the consequences. At 9:45 a.m., David Mitchell was escorted into the courtroom by a court officer. He looked nothing like the confident young man in Sarah's childhood photographs. His face was gaunt and weathered, his hair unkempt, his shoulders hunched as if he was trying to make himself invisible. He wore a cheap suit that didn't fit properly, and his hands trembled visibly as he was sworn in. When asked him his first question, "Please state your name for the record," David's voice was barely audible. "David Mitchell," he whispered. "Mr. Mitchell, are you the brother of Sarah Mitchell, the defendant?" "Yes, I am." "Mr. Mitchell, I need to ask you a very important question, and I need you to answer it truthfully. Did you commit the bank robbery that occurred on September 14th, 5 years ago?" The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Every person present seemed to stop breathing. David closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering courage from some deep internal reserve. When he opened them, tears were streaming down his face. "Yes," he said, his voice breaking. "Yes, I did it. I robbed that bank." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled frantically. Sarah felt tears spring to her own eyes. After 5 years, the truth was finally being spoken aloud in a court of law. David, for the next 2 hours, laying out the details of his crime in agonizing detail. He described how he and 2 accomplices, men named Caldwell and Torres, had planned the robbery for weeks. He explained how they'd chosen that particular bank because they knew the security system was outdated. He described the weapons they'd carried, the way they'd divided the money, and where they'd hidden the proceeds. Most importantly, that Sarah had known nothing about the robbery. She had never been involved. She had never even suspected. When he saw that she'd been arrested, he had told himself he would confess eventually, but fear had paralyzed him. So he'd run instead. "I let my sister rot in prison," David said, his voice raw with emotion. "I let an innocent woman go to jail for a crime I committed. I've been living with that guilt every single day for 5 years. There's no excuse for what I did. There's no excuse for letting her suffer while I hid." His examination was sympathetic and careful, drawing out the narrative that would support his client's exoneration. But everyone knew what was coming next. Prosecutor Richard stood slowly, his expression calculated and predatory. "Mr. Mitchell," began, his tone dripping with skepticism, "you're telling this court that you suddenly decided to confess to a crime you've hidden for 5 years because your conscience got the better of you." "Yes," David said quietly. "That's convenient timing, isn't it? Just days before your sister's retrial, when you knew that her conviction was in trouble." "I didn't know about the retrial until recently. My mother called me." "Your mother called you," interrupted. "The mother who loved you and never gave up on you. The mother who you've been sending money to, anonymously, so she'd stay quiet about your whereabouts." "I was trying to support her." "You were buying her silence," said coldly. "You were ensuring she wouldn't turn you in. And now, when it looks like your sister might actually walk free anyway, you come forward with this convenient confession. You claim you want to help her, but really you're just trying to avoid facing charges for harboring a fugitive yourself, aren't you?" "No, that's not true." "Mr. Mitchell, have you been promised anything in exchange for your testimony? Has Mr. promised you a lighter sentence, immunity from certain charges?" "No, he hasn't." "So you're testifying purely out of the goodness of your heart, the same heart that allowed you to let an innocent woman go to prison." David's face crumpled. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. I'm trying to fix it." "By committing perjury," challenged, "by fabricating testimony to help your sister." "I'm not lying. I did rob that bank." "Did you?" Paced back and forth in front of the jury box. "Or are you protecting someone else? Someone who really did commit the robbery, and you've decided that your sister is less important than protecting your friends? Caldwell and Torres, where are they, Mr. Mitchell?" "I don't know. We lost contact years ago." "How convenient. So the only people who could corroborate your story are conveniently unavailable." "I can prove what I'm saying," David said desperately. "Check my fingerprints. Check my DNA. I was at that bank. I was one of the robbers." "Your fingerprints weren't found at the scene," said with a smug smile. "Despite being one of the robbers, your fingerprints somehow weren't recovered. But my colleague's fingerprints, your sister's fingerprints, were found there. Now why do you suppose that is?" David didn't have an answer. He looked toward Sarah, desperately seeking help that wasn't coming. Continued his assault. "Mr. Mitchell, do you have any documentation of your whereabouts 5 years ago? Bank records, utility bills, anything that would corroborate your confession?" "No, I was living off cash. I was hiding." "So there's nothing but your word." "And I'll submit to any testing you want to do. I'm sure you will, now that you're facing potential charges. You're willing to confess to robbery to avoid more serious charges like perjury and conspiracy. You're a self-serving opportunist, Mr. Mitchell, and this jury can see through that." By the time finished his cross-examination, David looked destroyed. His testimony, which had seemed so powerful when he'd confessed the truth, had been systematically dismantled by a skilled prosecutor. The jury's expressions had shifted from sympathetic to skeptical. Some of them wouldn't even make eye contact with David as he stepped down from the stand. Sarah felt panic rising in her chest. David's confession should have exonerated her. His testimony should have proven her innocence, but had made it seem like David was just another criminal, willing to say anything to avoid punishment. As David was led out of the courtroom by a court officer, he and Sarah made brief eye contact. She saw the despair in his eyes, the crushing weight of his failure to help her even now. Stood and approached Judge. "Your Honor, the defense calls Detective James Riley and his K-9 partner, Officer Duke, to the stand." The courtroom erupted in whispers. K9 evidence. What could a dog possibly have to do with a bank robbery? Even Sarah didn't know what was planning. He'd kept this final piece of evidence completely hidden, even from her. As Detective Riley led Officer Duke into the courtroom, Sarah watched the jury's expressions shift from skeptical to curious. The German Shepherd was alert and well-trained, his ears perked, his movements controlled and purposeful. Was about to play his final card. Detective James Riley was a 23-year veteran of the Pennsylvania State Police, a man with a weathered face, steel-gray eyes, and the quiet confidence of someone who'd seen justice served in countless ways throughout his career. He walked Officer Duke into the courtroom with the ease of long partnership. The German Shepherd was a striking dog, sleek, muscular, with alert ears and intelligent eyes that scanned the room with professional awareness. The dog wore a harness marked with official insignia, and his composure was impeccable. This was not a pet. This was a working law enforcement officer. The courtroom had fallen completely silent. Even the reporters had stopped scribbling, their attention fixed on the unusual sight of a police dog being brought into the courtroom during a criminal trial. Prosecutor looked confused and slightly irritated. Judge leaned forward, her expression questioning. "Your Honor," began, "with the court's permission, I'd like to present evidence regarding canine detection of explosive residue. Officer Duke is a certified narcotics and explosives detection dog, trained by the FBI's detection dog program. He has been used successfully in over 200 criminal investigations." "Objection," said immediately standing. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Canine evidence is unreliable and has not been properly established as admissible in this jurisdiction." "Your Honor," countered, "canine detection of explosives residue is an established forensic technique that has been admitted in federal courts and in numerous state courts. The reliability of certified detection dogs has been documented extensively in peer-reviewed scientific literature. The specific explosive used in the bank robbery 5 years ago was C4. Officer Duke is trained to identify residue from this specific explosive. His detection record is documented and available for the court's review." Judge considered this for a long moment. She was a fair judge, careful about procedure, but also open to legitimate evidence. "I'll allow it," she said. "Proceed carefully, mister, and be prepared to establish the dog's reliability and training credentials." Called Detective Riley to the stand first, and over the next 40 minutes, he systematically established Officer Duke's qualifications. Riley about the dog's training, his certification, his success rate, and the specific protocol for explosives detection. He explained that dogs have an olfactory system approximately 40 times more sensitive than humans, and that Officer Duke had been trained to identify the specific chemical signature of C4 explosives. Officer Duke has successfully identified explosives residue in 214 criminal investigations. Riley. His detection accuracy rate is 98.6%. When he alerts, it indicates the presence of explosive residue that would have adhered to a person's skin, hair, or clothing during the handling or detonation of explosives. Attempted to challenge the reliability of canine evidence during cross-examination, but he was fighting against well-established science and documented track records. His arguments sounded desperate and unconvincing. Then came the moment had been waiting for. "Your Honor, I would like to conduct a detection with Officer Duke. I'd like to have the dog pass near David Mitchell, who is present in the courtroom." The entire courtroom froze. Even the bailiff seemed to stop breathing. David Mitchell's face went pale, shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate. You can't just—" "Your Honor," interrupted, "David Mitchell has that he was present at the bank during the robbery. That he handled the explosives that were used in the robbery. If he's telling the truth about his involvement, Officer Duke should detect explosive residue on his person or clothing." Judge looked at David Mitchell, then at Officer Duke. I'll allow it, but this will be conducted carefully and methodically. Detective Riley, you are responsible for ensuring this dog behaves appropriately in my courtroom. Mr. Mitchell, you will remain seated." David looked like he might vomit. His hands gripped the edge of the witness stand, his knuckles white with tension. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Detective Riley stood with Officer Duke and pointed to David Mitchell. "Walk the dog past the witness stand," instructed. Riley began to walk slowly toward the witness box where David sat. Officer Duke's entire demeanor changed as they approached. The dog's ears perked up, his tail straightened, and his nose lifted slightly, catching the scent. Riley continued walking slowly, deliberately, moving the dog closer to David. At approximately 3 feet away from David Mitchell, Officer Duke's training kicked in completely. The dog barked sharply, the specific alert signal he'd been trained to give for explosive residue. His body language shifted from casual to intensely focused. He pulled forward slightly against his leash, barking again, his nose pointing directly at David. "Alert," Detective Riley said formally. "The dog has alerted on the witness." Officer Duke circled closer, barking repeatedly, frantically sniffing David's clothing, his hands, his face. The dog's agitation was evident and professional. This was not aggression, but the intense focus of a trained detection dog who had found what he'd been trained to find. The courtroom erupted. Spectators gasped. Reporters jumped from their seats. Sarah's mother let out a small cry of shock and vindication. The jury members leaned forward, their eyes wide, their skepticism evaporating in the face of the dog's unmistakable alert. David Mitchell's face crumbled. His composure, already fragile, shattered completely. He looked like a man watching his carefully constructed lie collapse in real time. Officer Duke continued to circle him, barking insistently, his alert clear and unambiguous. There was no way to deny, no way to explain away, what the dog had detected. Judge banged her gavel. "Order, order in the courtroom." She looked at David Mitchell, her expression stern. "The dog has alerted. Mr. Mitchell, do you have any explanation for this?" David couldn't speak. His mouth opened and closed silently. His entire body trembled. Approached David slowly, allowing the moment to sink in. Officer Duke was led back to Detective Riley, who calmed the dog with a reward and gentle praise for his excellent work. The German Shepherd had done exactly what he was trained to do. He had found the truth. "Mr. Mitchell," said quietly, "Officer Duke has just detected explosive residue on your person. That residue matches the specific chemical signature of C4 explosives, the same explosives used in the bank robbery. The dog's detection rate is 98.6% accurate. The evidence is undeniable. You can continue to lie to this court, or you can tell the truth." David looked at Sarah. His sister sat with her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. For the first time, she saw genuine remorse and determination in her brother's eyes. Continued, "You said earlier that you didn't mind facing charges because you wanted to do the right thing. This is your moment. This is your chance to actually do the right thing. No more lies. No more prosecutorial tricks, just the truth." Judge looked at David with barely concealed disgust. "Mr. Mitchell, you are still under oath. The court will hear your response to this evidence." David took a shuddering breath. His hands shook so badly he could barely grip the edge of the witness stand. But when he spoke, his voice was clear and filled with the weight of finally surrendering to truth. "The dog is right," he said. "Everything the dog detected is right. I did it. I robbed that bank. I handled the explosives. I was there. Sarah is innocent. I am guilty. I let my innocent sister go to prison for 5 years while I ran away. I am a coward and a criminal, and I deserve to be punished." He looked directly at Sarah and his voice broke completely. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm so sorry. You didn't deserve any of this." The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. The truth, finally and irrevocably, had been spoken. The courtroom descended into controlled chaos. Judge banged her gavel repeatedly, calling for order while reporters rushed toward the exits to file their stories. Prosecutor Richard sat frozen in his seat, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. The case he'd won 5 years ago, the conviction he'd built his reputation on, was crumbling before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Stood perfectly still, allowing the moment to unfold. He had orchestrated this with meticulous precision, holding back Officer Duke's evidence like a master playing his final trump card. David Mitchell continued to sit in the witness stand, his entire body shaking, tears streaming down his face as the emotional dam he'd been holding back for 5 years finally broke. "Your Honor," said, his voice cutting through the noise of the courtroom, "based on the defendant's testimony, her innocent presence at the bank prior to the robbery, and David Mitchell's full and unequivocal confession corroborated by Officer Duke's detection of explosive residue, I move that this court declare a mistrial." Judge slammed her gavel once more, commanding silence. "We will have order in this courtroom," she thundered. The room quieted immediately. She turned to prosecutor. "Mister, I presume the state has no further witnesses." Stood slowly, his face flushed. "Your Honor, the state would like to request a brief recess to consult with my office regarding our position in light of this testimony." Judge said flatly, "The evidence is clear. Officer Duke's detection is corroborated by Mr. Mitchell's full confession. Sarah Mitchell's innocence is established beyond reasonable doubt. Furthermore, the original prosecution critical evidence in the first trial, as documented in the appellate record. This is a clear case of prosecutorial misconduct combined with exculpatory evidence." She looked directly at Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, you have been wrongfully convicted. This court declares a mistrial with prejudice. You are hereby exonerated." The words hung in the courtroom like a benediction. Sarah felt the room spin. Exonerated, free, innocent. The legal system that had failed her was now finally, officially declaring her innocence. Stood again attempting to argue. "Your Honor, if I may." "There is nothing more to argue, Mr. Judge said coldly. Your office deliberately exculpatory evidence from the defense in the original trial. That is a violation of v. Maryland. It is prosecutorial misconduct of the highest order. I am ordering an immediate investigation into your handling of this case, and I am recommending that the state bar be of potential ethical violations. Furthermore, I am recommending that the district attorney's office conduct a full review of your cases to determine if this misconduct occurred in other trials as well. This court will not tolerate the suppression of evidence that could exonerate defendants." Sarah Felt's hand on her shoulder. She turned to see tears in his eyes as well. He smiled at her, a genuine, radiant smile of triumph and vindication. But the most important moment came when David Mitchell was led out of the courtroom by court officers. As he passed Sarah's seat at the defense table, he stopped. The officers paused, allowing him a moment. "I'm sorry," David whispered to his sister. "I'm so sorry, I love you." Sarah stood without thinking and wrapped her arms around her brother, holding him tightly despite everything. Her voice broke as she spoke. "I forgive you. I forgive you because you finally told the truth." It was the most painful reconciliation, one born from years of betrayal and suffering, yet also from genuine redemption. David had finally, after 5 years, done the right thing. It didn't erase what he'd done, but it meant something. The officers gently separated them and led David away. As he passed Officer Duke, the German shepherd's tail wagged slightly, as if even the dog understood that this man had finally come to the right side of justice. Then came the moment Sarah had dreamed of for 5 years. Judge addressed the courtroom one final time. "Sarah Mitchell, you are free to go. You are exonerated of all charges. This court apologizes for the failure of the justice system that resulted in your wrongful conviction. You are entitled to seek compensation under the state's wrongful conviction statute. You are free." Sarah rose on shaky legs. Her mother rushed from the gallery, and they collided in the middle of the courtroom, holding each other as both women sobbed with a combination of relief, joy, vindication, and the residual trauma of 5 years of separation. "You're free, baby," Ruth whispered over and over, stroking her daughter's hair. "You're free, you're free, you're free." Hugged both women, his professionalism momentarily overwhelmed by genuine human emotion. His team of paralegals cheered from their seats. Detective Riley stood with Officer Duke, the man and dog exchanging a subtle acknowledgement of a job perfectly executed. But Sarah's attention was drawn to Officer Duke. She broke free from her mother's embrace and approached the dog. Detective Riley allowed her to do so, understanding the significance of the moment. Sarah knelt down in front of Officer Duke, and the dog approached her, his tail wagging gently. She buried her face in the dog's fur, and more tears came, tears of gratitude for a creature who had done what no human had managed to do for 5 years. He had told the unambiguous truth. "Thank you," she whispered to the dog, running her hands over his soft fur. "Thank you for saving me." Officer Duke licked her face, a gesture that transcended the professionalism of his training and spoke to something more fundamental, the capacity for compassion and understanding. Detective Riley placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. "He knew you needed help," he said simply. "He found the truth, that's what he does." As Sarah rose and turned back to her mother, she looked around the courtroom. The judge had retreated to her chambers. The jury had been dismissed. Prosecutor was gathering his papers with visible frustration and anger. The reporters were filing out, their phones already buzzing with messages to their editors. But in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that Sarah Mitchell was standing in a courtroom, not as a convict, not as a prisoner, not as someone guilty of a crime she didn't commit, but as a free woman, an innocent woman, a woman who had been wronged by the system but had fought with help in David's final redemption to reclaim her life. Approached her one final time. "You did it, Sarah. You're exonerated, you're free. No conviction, no record, just your life back." Sarah looked at her attorney, at her mother, at Detective Riley and Officer Duke. "I had help," she said. "I couldn't have done it alone." "No," agreed. "Justice requires all of us. It requires lawyers who refuse to give up. It requires investigators who dig for truth. It requires dogs trained to find what humans might miss. It requires the courage of people like David who finally confess. And it requires victims, innocent victims, who refuse to accept injustice. You did your part, Sarah. You refused to disappear quietly into the system. You fought. And today, the system finally worked the way it's supposed to work." As bailiffs led her toward the exit, toward freedom, toward the rest of her life, Sarah Mitchell smiled, a genuine, hopeful smile that reflected not bitterness, but the beginning of redemption and renewal. 2 weeks later, Sarah Mitchell walked out of the courthouse into brilliant autumn sunlight. The leaves were turning golden and crimson, painting the world in colors she'd almost forgotten existed. The last time she'd been outside a prison or courtroom was 5 years ago, and everything seemed both familiar and completely foreign at the same time. Her mother held her arm on one side and held her arm on the other. News cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but Sarah barely heard them. She was too focused on the sensation of freedom, the cool air on her skin, the sound of leaves rustling in the wind, the feeling of walking without an escort or guard beside her. "Sarah, Sarah," reporters called out. "How does it feel to be exonerated? Do you have any comment on your brother's sentence? Will you pursue civil litigation against the state?" Sarah stopped at the courthouse steps and turned to face the cameras. Her mother squeezed her hand supportively. Sarah took a breath and spoke clearly, her voice steady and strong. "I'm grateful to the court, to Detective Riley and Officer Duke, and most importantly to my attorney, who never gave up on me. My brother David made a terrible mistake 5 years ago, but he found the courage to tell the truth, and that means something. I'm not angry anymore. I'm just grateful to be free, and I'm committed to making sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to other innocent people." With that, she allowed to guide her toward a waiting car. As they drove away from the courthouse, Sarah watched the building recede in the distance, finally allowing herself to truly believe it was over. The state had awarded her a substantial wrongful conviction settlement, 850000, for the 5 years she'd spent in prison. Money couldn't replace those years, but it gave her options. It gave her choices. It gave her a chance to build a new life. 1 month after her exoneration, Sarah sat in a small office in Philadelphia and 3 other attorneys who had worked on wrongful conviction cases. They were discussing the founding of the Second Chances Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping wrongfully convicted individuals navigate the appeals process, connect with pro-legal services, and rebuild their lives after exoneration. "We'll focus on cases where there's strong evidence of innocence, but the original conviction was based on prosecutorial misconduct, faulty eyewitness identification, or inadequate legal representation," explained. "We'll work with forensic experts, investigators, and other legal professionals to overturn wrongful convictions." Sarah listened intently, her mind already spinning with possibilities. She thought about the women she'd met in prison, innocent women and guilty women alike, but all of them human beings deserving of a fair chance at justice. She thought about how many Sarah Mitchells might be sitting in cells right now, their cases gathering dust on appeal court dockets. "I want to be actively involved," Sarah said. "I don't just want to donate money. I want to work with the victims, to interview them, to listen to their stories. I want to be the person I wish I'd had when I was convicted." The attorneys exchanged glances and smiled. They'd been hoping Sarah would volunteer to participate directly in the foundation's work. Meanwhile, David Mitchell faced his own reckoning. At his sentencing hearing, 3 weeks after Sarah's exoneration, he stood before judge once again. He had pleaded guilty to the original armed bank robbery charges, as well as to new charges of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and perjury from his original trial testimony 5 years ago. David looked nothing like the gaunt, broken man who had in his sister's retrial. He had cleaned himself up, gained back some weight, and his eyes reflected genuine remorse rather than desperate manipulation. He spoke without notes, addressing the court directly. "Your Honor, I committed a serious crime," he began, his voice steady. "I robbed a bank, I endangered people's lives, and I allowed my innocent sister to go to prison for that crime. For 5 years I ran. For 5 years I lived with the guilt. I finally came forward not because I was caught, but because I couldn't live with myself anymore. I know my apology means nothing to the people I hurt. I know my confession doesn't erase Sarah's suffering. But I wanted to take responsibility, and I wanted to tell the truth." Judge listened carefully, her expression unreadable. When David finished, she delivered her sentence: 22 years for the original robbery charges, plus 5 additional years for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. David would serve his sentence in a federal penitentiary and would have the possibility of parole after 20 years, contingent on his behavior and continued remorse. Sarah attended the sentencing hearing. She sat in the gallery and watched her brother receive his sentence. She didn't feel angry or vindictive. She felt sad that her brother had thrown away so much of his life, sad that he'd put both of them through such suffering, but also proud that he'd finally found the courage to do the right thing. After the sentencing, she visited David in the holding cell one final time before he was transferred to federal prison. "I forgive you," she said simply. "I forgive you for what you did to me, and I forgive you for what you did to yourself. Maybe while you're in prison, you can figure out who you want to be when you get out. Maybe you can find redemption." David's eyes were wet with tears. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, Sarah." "No, you don't," Sarah agreed. "But you have it anyway, because I can't carry anger around with me for the rest of my life. It would destroy me the way guilt has destroyed you. So I'm choosing to forgive you and to move forward." 6 months after her exoneration, Sarah stood in a community center in Philadelphia, surrounded by volunteers and staff members of the Second Chances Foundation. The foundation had already taken on 7 cases of potentially wrongfully convicted individuals and had successfully appealed 2 of those convictions already. But today was special. Today, Sarah was meeting with a young woman named Williams, who had been convicted of armed robbery 10 years ago and was serving a 15-year sentence. His case had many similarities to Sarah's own: faulty eyewitness identification, evidence, an inadequate public defender. "I know what you're going through," Sarah told during their first meeting. "I know how it feels to sit in a courtroom and hear yourself convicted of a crime you didn't commit. I know how it feels to lose hope, but I also know that there are people who will fight for you. There are people who believe in the power of the truth, and sometimes, against all odds, the system works the way it's supposed to work." Cried, and Sarah held her hand. This was the work that mattered. This was why she'd survived prison. This was her purpose now. 1 year after her exoneration, Sarah visited the police station to meet with Detective James Riley and Officer Duke one final time. She brought a large donation for the police K-9 unit and a framed photograph of herself with Officer Duke from the day of her exoneration. Detective Riley hugged her warmly. "How are you doing?" he asked. "I'm good," Sarah said, and she meant it. "I'm really good. The foundation is helping people. I'm working on several cases. I'm living my life on my own terms for the first time in years." Officer Duke approached her, and Sarah knelt down to embrace the dog. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved my life." Officer Duke licked her face, and Sarah laughed, a genuine, joyful laugh that carried no trace of bitterness or trauma. As she left the police station that day, Sarah Mitchell felt something she hadn't experienced in 6 years: peace. Complete, undeniable peace. She had lost 5 years to an unjust conviction, but she had reclaimed her life, found her purpose, and discovered that even in the darkness of injustice, light could be found through truth, courage, and redemption. She walked through the Philadelphia streets as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. She was free. She was innocent. She was home. The system had failed her once, but it had ultimately worked. Truth had prevailed. Justice had been served. And Sarah Mitchell had transformed her suffering into purpose, her pain into passion, and her loss into a mission to help others find the second chances she had been given. The end.